Sometimes I let you guys suggest stories, and honestly, I should have braced myself because what even is this case today? Now, let me ask you something. When does taking justice into your own hands become the only option? Is it ever justifiable? What happens when the very system meant to protect people fails over and over and over again, and the person causing the harm just keeps getting away with it? Welcome to That's My Opinion, where we break down the biggest stories, uncover layers beneath them to explore what they mean in the bigger picture. I'm Bacon Bears, and today we're talking about Ken Rex McElroy. Yes, McElroy, not McElroy, which I thought for the entire duration of writing this script, it is in fact pronounced McElroy. But this is a man accused of tormenting an entire town for years until one day the town decides they're not going to take it anymore. There are up to 60 witnesses, yet somehow no one sees or hears a thing. Every one of my videos are alleged. Do your own research, make your own decisions. Let's get into it. Ken McElroy, who we'll refer to as Ken Rex in this episode, was often described as a career criminal who perpetually carried a weapon. Reports say he had a total of 21 indictments. You know how they say you can count on two hands? Well, I can't. But you know what I can count on one hand? His convictions. Because he only had one. One actual conviction. And what kind of charges are we talking about? Well, content warning ahead. These include multiple allegations of violent behavior, including shooting incidents, inappropriate relationships with minors, accusations of assault, arson, theft, cruelty to animals, burglary, even livestock theft. He was also known to threaten, stalk, and intimidate townspeople, especially witnesses involved in his cases. And yes, if you were wondering, that is in fact just the beginning. Ken Rex McElroy was born June 1st, 1934 in Overland Park, Kansas, making him a Gemini, and no, we don't claim him. He was the 15th of 16 children. I only have 2 kids, so I can't even imagine. By the time you're on baby number 15, as a mom, you've got to be like, you know what? Whatever. His parents, Tony and Mabel McElroy, were poor tenant farmers. And I didn't know this, but a tenant farmer is someone who farms land that they do not own. Ken Rex's upbringing wasn't just rough, it was reportedly violent. His father, Tony, was known to be abusive. In fact, Ken Rex's own daughter would later tell a story about how Tony used to beat him until he complied with whatever demand he had at the moment. Ken Rex dropped out of school at 15 years old, and by that point, he already had quite the reputation. He was known as a womanizer, a cattle rustler, and a small-time thief. And that's really where it all started. By the time he was fully terrorizing the town of Skidmore, he was hard to miss. He stood over 6 feet tall, weighed nearly 300 pounds. He had jet black hair, and he rocked mutton chops. He almost looked as if someone tried to draw Elvis, but with their non-dominant hand. And his eyes, icy blue, and described by many as cold and unsettling. It wasn't just what he did. It was the way that he looked at you while doing it. I think it's important that you get a really good idea of what Skidmore, Missouri looked like at this time. Skidmore, Missouri was a tiny, population, something around 400, tight-knit farming town in the late 1970s. Just a few hundred people, a handful of local businesses, and a place where everyone knew your name, your family, and your secrets. It was the kind of town where the church bells still rang on Sundays, where gossip spread faster than the newspapers, and where the same faces showed up at every diner booth, tractor auction, and town hall meeting. Now, the reports are that Ken Rex was a womanizer, but I want to be very clear. They were never women. They were children. He had an affinity for girls as young as 12. His buddies, just very nice young men, even applauding his eye for what he called, quote, young meat. Yuck. It's reported that he would hang out at junior highs and playgrounds, and just no one ever reported this behavior, I guess. And it's even said that he would befriend teenage boys just so he could get to their female counterparts. Ken Rex walked so R. Kelly could run. He would typically prey on children from poor, uneducated families and would charm these children with gifts and rides in his truck. In 1952, when Ken Rex was 18, he was married to his first wife, Oletta, who was 16, his first of 5 wives. A few years later, as Ken was getting older, he's around 26 to 28 at the time, his next wife would be even younger because he would marry Sharon, who was only 15 at the time of their marriage. While being married to Sharon, who was pregnant, by the way, and being a man of morals, he would begin a relationship with a girl named Sally, who was 13. And allegedly, there's a report that when Sally refused to be intimate with Ken Rex, he beat her into submission while also threatening to kill her father. And in a relationship with Sharon and Sally, and them having 7 children between them, by the time he was 30, he would start another relationship with a 15-year-old girl named Alice. He would then move Alice into his home with these 2 other girls and their children. So now Ken Rex had a personal collection of underage girls. But around 1970, McElroy would meet a little girl named Trina McLeod, who was only 12 years old, while he was 35, and she would eventually become his most notable wife. I just want to be very clear, no matter what you think of Ken Rex, because there are some people who like to excuse his behavior. It is never and will never be acceptable for a grown man to be with a child. In fact, it's illegal. A child cannot consent. A child does not have the brain development to make these sort of decisions, which is why there are laws against it. And in the 1970s, in Skidmore, Missouri, the age of consent was, in fact, 17 years old. Also, Missouri law did not recognize a defense of consent for minors under the age of 14. What does that mean? It means that any inappropriate activity with someone under that age would legally be considered statutory R, regardless of the circumstances. His relationship with each and every one of these girls is abhorrent and illegal. But how does a 35-year-old man start speaking to a 12-year-old girl? Well, according to reports, Ken McElroy paid one of her classmates so that he could get closer to her. So this classmate would pretend to be her boyfriend, picking her up from home, then bringing Trina to Ken Rex. And then when Ken Rex was done with her, the young boy would then walk her back home. And that way nobody would ask any questions. Trina would eventually start skipping school just to be with Ken Rex. And by 14 years old, she would become pregnant and drop out of school. So Ken Rex would move her into his home, which was already crowded with his other underage partners and their children. Now, I can hear someone frantically typing, "Where are these girls' parents?" It was said that Ken Rex would either pay off the parents or intimidate them until he got his way. Trina's parents would protest this relationship, to which allegedly Ken Rex would then burn their house down and, content warning, shoot their dog. Now, I say allegedly because not only was he never charged for this crime, but Trina would actually later say that the house was burnt down due to faulty wiring. We see Trina stand by Ken Rex and defend him, but you have to remember she was 12. She's groomed, and then she's raised by this man to be exactly what he wanted her to be. After Trina became pregnant at just 14 years old, local authorities in Nottoway County finally tried to hold Ken Rex accountable, which he was well known for being a PDF file, which I have to say on YouTube because you can't use real words here. But it was known that he liked the kids. However, they attempted to charge him with statutory R since Trina was well below Missouri's age of consent, which was 17. But Ken, as always, had a plan. To dodge the charges, he divorced one of his other underage partners and married Trina, not out of love, not out of responsibility, but to exploit a legal loophole. Because under Missouri law back then, a spouse couldn't be forced to testify against their partner. So once Trina became his wife, the prosecution's key witness is completely off the table. And with no one left to testify, the charges were dropped. Just like that. And Ken Rex would walk away once again untouched by a justice system he knew exactly how to manipulate. And I know you're thinking, how was he able to marry Trina? Well, he simply walked the paperwork over to her parents and intimidated them to sign Trina over. Don't forget, he has already allegedly burnt their house to the ground. And if you're like me, you're asking, but what about the baby? Isn't that proof? Well, The baby may have suggested an inappropriate relationship, but it didn't prove definitively that Ken was the father. Unless DNA testing, which was not commonly available at that time, was used, they really had no proof. And somewhere inside all of this chaos, after Trina had her baby, like within days, Trina and Alice escaped and ran to Trina's parents' house. However, Ken Rex would find them and allegedly bring them home at gunpoint, where he would abuse and assault them. And then he allegedly burnt Trina's parents' house down for a second time and shot their new dog. Let's take a breather, because it's very heavy. And it's going to get way worse. Like any new mother, Trina had to take her baby to the doctor. But during one of those visits, the doctor could tell something was not right. Eventually, the doctor was able to get Trina to open up about what was really going on in her life. And the doctor would call welfare services immediately. Finally. But don't get too hopeful, because it's reported that her baby was taken into foster care and Trina was sedated and hospitalized, likely in an attempt to protect her from Ken Rex. At one point, she was even placed in a foster home herself. But would that stop Ken Rex? Does anything ever stop Ken Rex? He eventually tracked down the foster home where Trina was staying, and instead of charging in, he did what he always did. He used intimidation. He would park his truck outside the foster home, and he would just sit there for hours, staring, watching, waiting. And when the foster family called the police, they were told that Ken Rex was well within his legal rights to just park there and stare at your home. And when just sitting there didn't work, he allegedly started making threatening phone calls. And when that didn't work, he took it a step further. He told the foster family that he would trade them girl for girl. But what does that even mean? Well, Ken Rex had apparently found the school bus route that the foster family's biological daughter took to get to school. And the message was clear. He was threatening to kidnap their child in exchange for Trina. The foster family would call law enforcement again. And what would they do? Say it with me, folks. Nothing. Terrified and helpless, the foster family caved. They gave Trina back, not because it was right, not because it was legal, but because they were afraid. They knew the system wouldn't protect them. So once again, Ken Rex McElroy wins. And Trina would stay with Ken Rex until the day that he died, often being seen by many as actually a part of the problem. She was right there beside him, almost like a twisted version of Bonnie and Clyde. Together, Ken and Trina had 4 children. But as for Ken's total number of kids, the most consistent number that I could find was 10. But there have been conflicting reports. And honestly, it wouldn't be surprising if there were more. I have found reports up to 21, but we'll just stick at 10 for this video. Now, before we move on, I think it's important to note that Trina herself has publicly denied a lot of what's been said about Ken Rex. She claimed that none of it was true, that he was a kind husband and a good father, and that she didn't understand why the town or the police were always after him. In her own words, maybe they were just jealous. On July 27th of 1976, a local Skidmore farmer named Romae Henry was working in his shed when he heard gunshots ring out in the distance, but they were close enough that they might have been on his land. So concerned, he grabs his keys and he decides to go investigate. As Romae Henry drove out toward the edge of his property, he spotted Ken Rex McElroy parked near the field, sitting in his pickup truck with a shotgun propped beside him. And this wasn't the first time McElroy had been spotted firing off rounds on somebody else's land, but this time, Romae has had enough. He pulls up, he gets ready to confront Ken Rex, but before he could even say a word, Ken swings open the door and shoves a double-barrel shotgun right in his face. Ken starts yelling. Nonsense, really, accusing Romae of being at his house in a white Pontiac. And Romae had no idea what he was even talking about. But it didn't matter because Ken Rex didn't care about the truth. He cared about control. And without warning, Ken pulls the trigger. And Romae was blasted in the stomach. As he tried to crawl out of the truck, a second shot hit him, with buckshot hitting him in the face, tearing into his skin. And then, divine intervention, luck, fate, whatever you want to call it, the gun jams. One small moment gave Romae just enough time to get back into his truck, slam the door, and hit the gas. He races home, bleeding and in shock, and his wife rushes him to the hospital. And the very next day, Ken Rex McElroy was charged with assault with intent to kill. I want to take a minute to introduce the man who stood beside Ken Rex in court more times than anyone should have. His longtime attorney, Richard Gene McFadden. McFadden was known as a skilled and ruthless defense attorney, famous for finding legal loopholes and dragging out cases for months, sometimes even years. He reportedly represented Ken in over 20 criminal cases, and time after time, he helped him walk free, whether by discrediting witnesses, delaying trials, or just exhausting everyone until they simply gave up. And if that wasn't shady enough, there's even a rumor that he had ties to the mob. So do with that what you will. And in this case, McFadden did exactly what he was known for. He dragged the trial out over and over and over again, filing delay after delay. And meanwhile, Ken Rex was doing what he did best, intimidating the victim, which is highly illegal, but here we are. Romae Henry later reported that Ken drove past his house or parked outside more than 100 times, just sitting there watching. And when Romae called the sheriff to report the harassment, the sheriff's response, I'll talk to him. But nothing changes. And in fact, after he makes that phone call, Ken keeps showing up. No consequences, no protection, just more fear. And as always, the message is clear. Testify and you'll regret it. But eventually the trial did happen, and Romae Henry bravely takes the stand, looks Ken Rex McElroy dead in the eye, and testified that Ken was the one who shot him. Two of Romae's neighbors also backed him up, saying that they saw Ken driving away from the scene around the time of the shooting. But Ken came prepared with two of his hunting buddies, who probably applauded him for liking young meat. And they would swear up and down that Ken was with them during the time of the incident. And that was all they needed for reasonable doubt. And you'll be thrilled to know that Ken Rex McElroy was acquitted. After the acquittal, Ken Rex didn't just walk away. He bragged about it around town. He'd openly talk about beating the case like it was a game that he'd won. And a few months later, Romae Henry had another chilling encounter. He was out on his tractor working his land when he spotted a truck in the distance. As he got closer, he realized it was Ken Rex. And this time, Ken Rex was holding a rifle, aiming it right at him. Romae said he heard a gunshot, and then just like that, Ken casually gets back into his truck and drives off into the distance, like nothing even happened. It's April 25th of 1980, and a few of Ken Rex McElroy's children walk into the B&B grocery store, a small family-owned store in Skidmore, a quaint little shop where everyone knew each other. But what started as a normal day quickly escalates in this town. According to reports, one of the younger children walked out with a piece of candy, possibly without realizing it hadn't been paid for. The store clerk yelled out at the kids, and things spiral. The oldest sibling gets upset. The little one starts crying. The older girl puts the candy back, saying, "Nobody accuses my little sister of stealing." And then the kids run home and tell their parents what happened. Well, that's when Ken Rex and Trina show up at the grocery store. Ken has a pocket knife in his hand, and Trina reportedly threatened the store's co-owner, Lois Bowencamp, saying she was going to, quote, whoop her ass. But then Ernest Bo Bowencamp, Lois's husband and co-owner of the store, steps in. He tries to calm things down. According to Bo, it was all just a simple misunderstanding, a mix-up at the register. It looked like the little girl may have thought that the candy had already been paid for, and the store owners weren't trying to make a scene. And for a moment, things seemed like they might settle. Ken muttered, "You know what? Fine, I'll just take a pack of Camels." But Bo stops him and says, "Actually, you're banned from the store." And you can probably guess that Ken Rex does not take this well. So naturally, as Ken Rex does, honestly, if he had a job, he wouldn't have all this time on his hands. So naturally, as Ken Rex does, he starts his usual game of intimidation. He begins driving past the Bowencamp home, sometimes just sitting outside, staring. Classic Ken Rex. No words, just presence. Just enough to make you feel watched, unsafe, and threatened. But what Ken didn't expect was Lois Bowencamp. And let me tell you, Lois is quite the little spitfire. She wasn't about to put up with Ken Rex's bullshit. She calls the deputy sheriff and tells him what's going on. And the response? Don't worry about it. He won't do nothing. What? And just days later, Ken Rex intentionally crossed paths with Lois Bowencamp. And in one of the most bizarre moments yet, he offers her $100 if she would just challenge Trina to a street fight. What? Like, sir, aren't you the one who likes to hit women? Naturally, Lois would shut this down. She told him that this is absolutely ridiculous and she would walk away. But Ken was not done with them. On another night, Ken and Trina drove by the Bowencamp home while the family was inside, along with their children. Ken Rex started firing shots into the air. He drives off, circles back, and he fires again. Lois did what anyone would do. She called the police. She reports the shooting, and the response that she got, just keep an eye out for him. That was it. No report, no protection, nothing. And sure enough, even after that phone call, Ken would then circle back again, firing more shots near their home. And the message was clear. I can do what I want, when I want, and nobody's going to stop me. On July 8th of 1980, Ernest Bo Bowencamp was doing what he did every day, working at the B&B grocery store, the store he owned with his wife. He was out back cutting up boxes when suddenly Ken Rex McElroy appears. The two exchange some words, but as Bo turned to walk away, he stops and he decides to look back. And when he did, he found himself staring down the barrel of a double-barrel shotgun. Ken Rex pulls the trigger, shooting Ernest Bowencamp in the neck. And then he just walks away. When the police arrived, they asked Bo who had done this. And with the little strength that he had left, the only word that Bo could manage to say was McElroy. Ken Rex McElroy was arrested just hours later. He claimed that he didn't know what they were talking about. He hadn't been there. He didn't do anything, but police took him down to the station. They booked him and they charged him. And for a moment, it seemed like justice might finally be on its way. Don't get too excited, because less than 24 hours, Ken Rex was out on a $30,000 bond, free again, like nothing had happened. Now, call it fate, call it divine intervention, or just plain luck. Again, Ernest Bo Bowencamp lives. Eventually, a trial was set, but at this point in the story, you already know what happens whenever someone tries to hold Ken Rex McElroy accountable. He went straight back to his usual tactics, intimidating witnesses, parking in front of their houses, circling the Bowencamp store, and just making his presence known over and over again. No consequences. Lois Bowencamp has had enough. The police aren't doing anything, so she writes letters to the governor, the attorney general, the state legislators, and she's like begging anybody, somebody, just step in and stop this man. But still, crickets. And meanwhile, Ken Rex was spinning his own version of the shooting, claiming it was self-defense. He told people Bo had lunged at him with a knife and that he only shot him to protect himself. Now, there's one man named David Dunbar who was the first person on the scene after Bo was shot. He was a part-time town marshal making about maybe $3,000 a year, just a regular guy doing his civic duty. And eventually, Dunbar crossed paths with Ken Rex, who asks him flat out, "You gonna testify?" And Dunbar says, "Yeah, of course, it's my job." And Ken Rex responded, "I'll kill anyone who tries to put me in jail." Then he walks to his truck, he grabs a shotgun, and he comes back. Somehow, miraculously, there is a guardian angel that sits over Skidmore, I swear to God. David Dunbar de-escalates this situation. He got in his car and he radioed the sheriff. And you know what the sheriff said? "Don't provoke him. There's nothing we can do. Just keep an eye on him." What? After that, David Dunbar is like, "You know what? I have a family. And I do not get paid nearly enough for this." My friend had told me one time, she said, "That's a six-figure problem, and you do not pay me six figures." That's what David Dunbar said. He's like, "I'm out of here." And he goes in, and he hands in his badge, and he quits his job. Which, yeah, I would too. The police aren't protecting the civilians, And now the police aren't even protecting their own. The Bowencamp trial finally comes, and the prosecutor, David Baird, had a strategy. He decided to pursue a charge that he knew he could make stick, even if it meant going with something less severe. And the goal wasn't to make headlines. It was to finally get Ken Rex convicted. And here's the wild part. The jury wasn't even allowed to hear anything about Ken Rex's history. Not the fact that he had a house full of teenage girls he called wives. Not the fact that he was a town bully for decades. Not the fact that he had been indicted 21 times and almost always walked free. None of it. But in the end, the jury convicted McElroy. Not of attempted murder, but of second-degree assault. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison. But of course, where there's an up, there's a down. He was released on bond while he appealed. And just like that, Ken Rex McElroy never spent a single day behind bars for shooting a man in the neck. And at this point, the cup has truly runneth over. The town of Skidmore, Missouri has had enough. Ken Rex McElroy wasn't just some bully. He had become what some people were now calling a rural terrorist. And after years of intimidation, threats, abuse, and failed justice, the townspeople decided it was time to do something. They called a meeting at the Legion Hall, inviting Sheriff Dan Estes to attend. The hall is packed. Around 60 people show up, all angry, all scared, all desperate for a solution. And they ask him, the sheriff, what are you going to do? How are you going to protect us? And Sheriff Estes says, maybe you guys should start a neighborhood watch. And one of the townspeople is like, isn't that literally your job? Because the town had already been watching for years. They had watched Ken Rex terrorize their neighbors, shoot innocent people, and walk away every single time. And they were done. And Sheriff Estes must have gotten the memo too, because shortly after that meeting, he gets in his little sheriff car and he drives straight out of town. Well, word had started to spread. Ken Rex McElroy was back in town. He and Trina had driven in and made their way to the D&G Tavern. They walk in, cool as ever, like nothing had ever happened. And Ken carried in a .22 caliber Ruger rifle with a bayonet fixed to it, and he set it down on the bar. He orders a beer, he leans back, and he starts telling everybody in the bar what he had planned to do to Ernest Bo Bowencamp with that weapon. And it's reported that the same 60 people who had just been at the Legion Hall right down the street walked together into the D&G Tavern. They didn't shout. They didn't confront him. They just stand there, quietly surrounding him, filling the room with tension so thick you could feel it in your chest. Ken Rex McElroy finishes his drink, casually buys a 6-pack of beer, and with Trina at his side, the two of them get up and walk outside. It's around 10:45 a.m. The town of Skidmore is already alive. People are out. The sun is shining. Not a cloud in the sky. And as Ken Rex McElroy and Trina get back into their pickup truck, the crowd from the bar, the same people who had silently surrounded him inside, followed them out. And then chaos. Gunshots rang out from multiple directions. No one knows how many shooters there were. Some say at least 2, others say more. All anyone knows is that Ken Rex McElroy's truck is lit up. Bullets shattered glass, pierced metal, and in the middle of it all, Ken was hit. Trina manages to escape, opening the passenger door and narrowly making it out alive. But Ken Rex McElroy died in the driver's seat, his foot stuck on the accelerator, pressing it down so hard that the engine begins to smoke. No one calls 911. Not a single person. They just turn around and they walk away, back to their homes, back to their lives, like nothing ever happened. How is it possible that according to some reports, there were over 60 witnesses standing in broad daylight and not one person could say who fired the gun? In the aftermath of Ken Rex's death, 23 law enforcement officers from 6 different agencies descended on Skidmore, Missouri. And that's more manpower than we ever saw in any investigation into McElroy himself. They set up a telephone tip line. Not one single person called. At one point, investigators said that they had 35 leads, and every single one, a dead end. They convened a grand jury hoping that under oath, someone would finally break their silence, but they didn't. The jury ruled that Ken Rex McElroy died from bullets fired by person or persons unknown. Because here's the thing. Ken was hit by 2 different caliber bullets. That means at minimum, 2 people shot him. But still, no arrests, no charges, no accountability. Investigators said there just wasn't enough evidence. And to be fair, this wasn't the era of cell phones or cameras or Ring doorbells. All they had was a town that refused to speak. The only person willing to say anything was Trina McElroy, the one person sitting beside him in the truck when the bullets started flying. She said that she saw the shooters and even named one of them, Del Clement, a local man known in the community. Del Clement was a local Skidmore resident and bar owner. While he was widely rumored within the community to have pulled the trigger, Del was never charged, and no formal evidence ever tied him to the crime. He lived the rest of his life in Skidmore and died in 2009, still maintaining his innocence. Despite the silence, the U.S. Department of Justice ordered an FBI investigation bringing federal agents into tiny Skidmore. And all I can say is, can you imagine if that kind of investigation had been launched for any one of those underage girls that Ken Rex preyed on? Because it never was. They never got that kind of attention. He was only important when he was the victim. The FBI reportedly turned over what they called important evidence, but even that wasn't enough. Prosecutor David Baird later said, quote, "After careful consideration and evaluation, I have determined that there is not currently sufficient evidence with which to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt." In a documentary interview, Bair added that it was his job to secure a conviction. And in this case, he wasn't confident that he could do that. Not with no witnesses, no weapon, and a town that had made its decision and wasn't going to budge. In 1984, Trina would file a wrongful death suit against basically everyone. The suit would be against Sheriff Estes, the mayor, Del Clement, the county, Skidmore, but everyone would just settle for $17,600. And I've watched a lot of Trina's interviews, and honestly, they're hard to watch. It is really sad. She stood by Ken Rex through the entire ordeal, and even long after his death. And what's even more heartbreaking is that she never seemed to fully understand why the townspeople were so against him. From start to finish, this story is tragic. And as the town of Skidmore goes, they don't want to be remembered for this. They don't want to be known as the place where vigilante justice happened. They just wanted to move on, to live in peace. And while some people in the town were quoted saying things like good riddance, others were more conflicted. That's the kind of strange grief this story leaves behind, not just about a man, but about what it means when a community breaks. And some folks in Skidmore didn't agree with what happened. They believed people shouldn't take justice into their own hands, and it should have been left up to the law. Which honestly brings up a valid fear. If people start deciding justice for themselves, who's next? What's next? Reporters have returned to Skidmore again and again. But from what I've read, when a stranger shows up in Skidmore asking questions, all the doors close. Nobody talks. And I just watched the documentary, No One Saw a Thing. And you get to hear from some of Ken's children. And from what they say, it sounds like they mostly only knew what happened inside of their home. It didn't seem like they had a terrible upbringing or they really understood the full extent of what their father did. And I cannot imagine what it's like to grow up carrying that last name, that legacy, that weight. But now I want to hear from you. Did your idea of vigilante justice change from the beginning of this video to the end? Let me know your thoughts in the comment box down below. My name is Bacon Bears, and that's my opinion. I'll see you next week.